Okay, while FEMA was botching up their response to Hurricane Helene, where was Kamala Harris? She wasn't on the ground. I think I saw a video of her putting some things in a plastic bag, like, oh, rescue packages. Okay, it looks like you're sending a care package to your kid at college. That's not what the people on the ground need. Kamala Harris, it was really just for show. It was political pandering. Who even knows where she was? Well, I'll tell you where she was. She was on a sex podcast called Call Her Daddy. I'm sad to say for the state of our country that Call Her Daddy is one of the most popular podcasts in the entire country. It is tawdry, it's vulgar, it's sexually explicit. I mean, I find it to be quite offensive, and I'm not a prude, but it's gross. You can go, I hate to even recommend that you do this, but if you want an example of what kind of discussions are had on this podcast, just go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and scroll through the titles of some of the episodes. You'll see exactly what this podcast talks about without having to listen to it. It's hosted by a young woman named Alex Cooper. She's Gen Z. She's promiscuous. She talks about her sexual exploits in graphic detail, and has guests on that do the same. A lot of Hollywood actresses go on and talk about, like I said, very graphic sex stuff. So why would Kamala Harris go on this show? Does that not debase a sitting vice president to go on a sexually graphic podcast that's just gross and vulgar and disrespectful and demeaning of women? Well, the answer is yes, it does debase Kamala Harris. But maybe Kamala Harris is past the point of caring whether she debases herself or not. She went on this podcast and she talked about, well, you guessed it, abortion. The reason she talked about abortion is Call Her Daddy is the most viewed podcast for women in the country. I know, it's a very sad commentary on our country. And listen, I'm not even going to sit here and debunk all the lies she told. You know that what Kamala Harris said about abortion and Amber Thurman and women's rights and Roe v. Wade, you know all of that's a lie. You're smart people. I don't need to walk through exactly what lies she told. But I was talking about this appearance, Kamala Harris's appearance on Call Her Daddy, with my producer, Tim, before this show. We were discussing how we were going to analyze this. And what was interesting, actually, was not what Kamala Harris said, but the reason why she went on that show. I had said, well, she went on that show because Gen Z voters don't turn out to vote in as high numbers as other generations. And Tim said, okay, all these people that listen to her show are already left-leaning. And I agree with that. I think that's correct. And so the reason she went on there wasn't actually to convince anybody or to bring new information. It was just to get people excited to vote. It was almost like when she not walked out, but after Joe Biden announced that he was not seeking re-election, they installed Kamala Harris, put her up on that pedestal and said, she's actually who you're going to vote for, even though no voter chose her. People got a little bounce of excitement on the left. They said, oh, the first woman president. That's why Kamala Harris went on Call Her Daddy. Let me read you a couple of numbers that I found. Gen Z only has, of all the Gen Z, men and women, only 40% of them are registered to vote. That's not a very high number. It's the lowest number for any generation. Only 40%. So Kamala Harris, when you're campaigning, you're basically looking at a voter in two ways. Do I need to convince them to vote for me, or do I just need to turn them out to vote? Well, Tim is correct. These voters already lean left. She doesn't need to convince them to support her. All she needs to do is convince them to turn out to vote. It's almost the equivalent, in a way, of Donald Trump going on Theo Von's podcast, because Theo Von's podcast has the opposite people who watch. He has young men who lean right who watch his podcast. So Donald Trump didn't have to go on that podcast and convince them to like him. He just had to go on that podcast and convince them to turn out to vote. And there are a shocking number of both young Democrats and young Republicans who, even if they identify as Democrat and Republican, don't cast their ballot. So it's only 40% who are registered to vote. But of that 40%, according to a Harvard Harris poll, only 74% of young Democrats said they're definitely going to vote, compared to 60% of young Republicans who say they're definitely going to vote. So you could argue that it was a strategic move of Kamala Harris to go on this sex podcast, as demeaning and debasing as it is, because she knows that there are groups of people who already agree with her ideology, don't need to be convinced that they like her or her policies. They just need to be motivated to go vote. That's what she was doing on that podcast. So again, you know that she told lies. I know that she told lies. It's a longer project to convince the young women who watch this podcast that Kamala Harris is telling her lies. I hope and I pray that some of these young women see the light between now and election day in 1 month, but it's not a 1 month project to ideologically reclaim and reform people who have bought into generations of lies about life and about abortion. That's what I'll say about Kamala Harris's appearance on Call Her Daddy. But the perception that she went on a sex podcast when victims of Hurricane Helene need her, that's disgusting.